Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today is Sunday, April 16th. For me, it's actually late night Saturday. But today I had the privilege, or yesterday I had the privilege of attending our local lay Dominican chapter meeting at the seminary in Charlotte, and we were studying the Summa Contra Gentiles of Thomas Aquinas and talking about the relationship between St. Thomas's teaching on the nature of man and this current controversy, this current transgender controversy. And the topic of discussion was pretty interesting, in my opinion. And as I was coming home, I said, I'd like to get into this a little bit because I think there's a lot that needs to be said. And I think that the Christian message in response to this transgender stuff has been pretty weak and ineffective. And so I'd like to point out some issues and try to suggest some improved lines of argument when discussing these things. Before I go any further, I want to apologize in advance because you may hear some dogs barking during this talk. We're dog sitting for my daughter, and we've got her two dogs here, and they're fussing a little bit. So hopefully you can ignore the background noise and enjoy the discussion. Now, when it comes to this transgender topic, normally for Christian people, the context in which we hear of these things is through YouTube videos or Twitter posts and things like that, where someone like Matt Walsh or Ben Shapiro is giving a public talk, and they're facing questions from the audience, open mic sort of questions, and then discussions develop, and maybe a little debate type discussion follows. Now, these videos and talks are often misleading because they're conducted in places where the audience is there to support the speaker, who usually represents, the Christian position on transgenderism. And the people who stand up and argue are usually courageous but isolated individuals who don't represent the opinions of the audience. And the audience usually overreacts in favor of the popular conference speaker. And often I find that when I watch these talks, I find that the transgender people who argue often present very strong arguments that are not actually responded to by the speakers. And the folks in the audience just ignore the good points that the transgender people make because they're just looking to be entertained by the speakers, who are usually quick-witted and charismatic and, sometimes even comical. But if we listen honestly and fairly to the transgender people, they bring up many good points, and the speakers fail to respond to those points. And I'd like to try to do a little better job in this talk of actually listening to the position of the transgender people and responding to them in a more helpful way. And by doing so, I hope that I can help some other Christians to think more carefully about these issues and actually address the things being said, not just continue to copy and paste or repeat the same dead, impotent lines that are used by Christians that don't even address the real issues or that misrepresent actual Christian teaching on these issues, because it's very complicated stuff. Now, I don't like to get my source material when I'm thinking about a different viewpoint or a position on a controversial issue. I don't want to get my information from Christian sources. We would never allow, let's say, a Muslim website to tell people what Catholics believe. We would say, if you want to know what Catholics believe, go read the Catechism. Go, listen to lectures given by Bishop Barron or by the Dominicans or someone like that. You don't go to a Baptist church and let them tell you what Catholics believe. That's not how we seek to understand the views of other groups. We seek out their best representatives, and we let them explain things for us. And sometimes maybe we find an intelligent and careful, neutral source that can serve as something of a mediator and give us an objective description of the views that they learn from that other group. And what I'd like to do in this talk is go through such a source. I'll share it with you here. Just bear with me. So this is an article online. You can see it's published by the American Psychological Association. So we're not just closing ourselves into the echo chamber here and listening to the same 5 Christian speakers give us all of the information that we live by. We're going to take a walk through an article where the American Psychological Association, which represents a modern, secular research organization of hopefully academic professionals who deal directly with these transgender people, gather information from them, learn from them, and so on. We're going to let them answer some basic questions about this transgender position and then respond to those actual responses, which I think more fairly represent the other side of this debate. So I'd like to go through this Q&A that they've published, which I think is pretty helpful. I haven't read through it in detail, so this is not prepared or anything like that. But we're just going to walk through this, read the questions that are asked, which I think are pretty common questions, and then read the responses from the American Psychological Association, and then think about them a little bit and talk about how Christians can respond to them more intelligently, especially Catholics, how we can actually maintain the Catholic faith while responding to these things without just lazily, repeating things that are basically coming from Protestant ideas rather than Catholic ideas. Because, like I said, this is a really, really interesting and complex issue. And when the debate starts, that complexity begins to open up, and the responses from Christians are often easily dismissed by these transgender people because they really aren't true. And so I'd like to get into this and point out some of these issues and hopefully inspire you to study it a little more carefully and speak about it a little more carefully. So let's go ahead and get started here and walk through. You can see the title of the article is Understanding Transgender People, Gender Identity and Gender Expression. And that's what we should desire to do. That's the obvious first step of the process in beginning to have a helpful, evangelistic discussion with other people. We just have to take time first and learn. We have to learn what they're actually saying, what they're actually doing, and gather information first so that we can respond to them sincerely and accurately. And by doing so, we gain their trust, because they can see that we're not just trying to blow them up and round them up and throw them into prison. We're not acting like ISIS and just seeking to kill anyone who doesn't submit to our religious views. We're honestly seeking to understand what this controversy really comes down to, because as human beings who confess ourselves to be sinners and who understand that man is fallen as a race, we understand that there's all kinds of problems that people experience, and because we know very well our own sins, we're not surprised or offended by anybody else's sins. And so we can have a humility and an honesty to just listen and learn and understand what other people are actually saying, and then respond to it fairly and accurately. And we can even say empathetically, because The cross that some people have to bear in this life is different from the cross that others of us have to bear. And we can empathize not with the details of the situation itself, but with just the general understanding that we have crosses to bear, and this life is confusing and often very difficult. So let's try to do what this article intends to help us do, which is to understand transgender people, really think about what's being said, and then try to prepare intelligent, faithful, Catholic responses to these issues that are raised, because I think we'll see some common themes. All right, so let's just get started with this. I don't want to waste too much time. In this first paragraph, I want to deal with this one statement that is actually in the opening of this article. We read here, transgender is an umbrella term for persons whose gender identity, gender expression, or behavior does not conform to that typically associated with the sex to which they were assigned at birth. Now, this is a red flag to begin with, because when we hear that something is an umbrella term, we can't use the term then in reasoning. You know, that's one of the first lessons in reasoning, is we can't deal with so-called umbrella terms. Philosophically, what this means is that the term transgender is used multifariously. So in one conversation, transgender can mean one thing. In another conversation, in another conversation, transgender can be used in a different way, and we can't simply stick the word into different sentences and arguments, because the meaning or the definition of the word is changing in different contexts. So we can't allow for any kind of logical discussion, we can't allow for any so-called umbrella terms. So that's a red flag for us, that we're going to have to be careful using this word transgender, because it's used in different ways by different people, and we're going to have to always make sure that we define the term clearly as we're currently using it, and then use it consistently as we talk about it. All right, so there's an admission right here in the beginning that this transgender controversy is going to have trouble because the word itself is not clearly defined. All right? And then we get into some other clarifying points, but you can see that there's confusion about gender and sex and one's personal identity. And what I want to draw attention to is the fact that what's going on here is really something fascinating. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think that there's something going on inside these people, and it's an increasingly significant number of people where they're experiencing something of a conflict between what they're being told about themselves and what they think or desire to think about themselves. And they're sort of unconsciously acknowledging something that we want them to acknowledge, that's actually good as a part of an evangelistic discussion. And think about what this conflict is. We have people in our society who are being raised in a society that has chosen to abandon religion and philosophy and devote itself entirely to modern science, with a mindset that's called naturalism or materialism, where it's believed that there's really no spiritual beings, there's no spiritual influences, but that there's a natural or material cause of everything that we experience in life. This is what modern science really is about. It's about seeking to understand the natural causes of all of our experiences, but it's based on an assumption that there are actually natural causes for all human experiences, and as Christians we don't believe that. So the whole idea of modern science is based on an assumption that's false. And it creates this secular, materialistic mindset that really is unsatisfying to human beings, because human beings know intrinsically that they are not just physical bodies. They know that there's more, not only to the world, but they know that there's more to themselves than that they're just physical bodies. So anytime we hear these transgender people talking, we've got to realize that while what they say may initially be upsetting, what they're saying is actually a rejection of this modern materialistic secular worldview. It's sort of a frustration, an indwelling frustration with this oversimplification of the human person. Notice that this description of transgender, and I use the word description because a definition identifies the genus and the differences of a term. If we don't give if we don't give that information about a term, we're really not defining it, we're just describing it. So this would be considered a description of the word transgender. But if we read this description, we have to pay attention to these words because they're interesting. It says the person's identity, expression, or behavior does not conform to that typically associated with the sex to which they were assigned at birth. And just pay attention to that language. It's assuming that the gender of a person is assigned to him or her at birth based on his biological features. And so this is a very materialistic, naturalistic view of gender where the baby is born, we look, we see male body parts or female body parts, and therefore we label the gender as male or female. Now, to most people that seems reasonable and that seems true, but what I want you to realize is that it's just entirely biological. It's entirely materialistic and natural, okay? And what we're going to find is that having that view of gender or even of sex is going to lead to trouble in these arguments as we get further into them. And I want you to, at least at this point, pump the brakes on this assumption that it's that simple, that biological, physical body parts can be equated with gender. I just want you to keep that as a thought that is the subject of discussion here, and don't assume that the answer is already concluded. Be open to this discussion because this is where things get really interesting. But notice that they see themselves as being identified by a certain gender biologically, like they're some kind of physical animal that's simply being identified as male or female. And they don't like that. So for some reason, they feel like this naturalistic worldview overly simplifies their experience. And that's really fascinating and interesting, that they're rebelling not against Christianity in this point. They're rebelling against this oversimplified materialism of modern science and saying, I don't want you to tell me what I am based on, let's say, my physical body. I'm more than that. They're testifying to the truth that they feel like there's more to them than just a physical body. And we should realize that this is sort of like the crying of a human soul saying, you're oversimplifying what I am. There's more going on inside of here. This body is full of all kinds of life that can't be explained by mere physical things and realities. There's invisible and immaterial stuff going on in here that makes me feel much more complicated than the materialistic modern biology is allowing for. So I think that our first response to this, which is to say, "Pa, that's stupid. Your that's not a serious response, and we're not listening to what's actually being said, because what's being said is actually very interesting. And we should want to sort of stoke this fire a little bit and keep this discussion going because it's good. So you realize that there's more to you as a person than just the body. You realize there's something more. Now, these people, they don't necessarily know what that is or what's going on, but they just have this sense that it's not so simple. And that's true. It's not so simple. So let's keep that in mind, that this discussion is not necessarily a bad thing to get into. And it may actually be a means by which, they're sort of reaching out for explanations of why they feel like the life they're living is more complicated than the biology book tells them it should be. So let's keep that in mind. All right, let's get into these questions. What is the difference between sex and gender? So we've got these two terms, sex and gender. What's the difference between the terms sex and gender? And we have some descriptions here. Sex is assigned at birth and refers to one's biological status as a male or female. So sex is sort of a biological term. Sex is assigned at birth, not really assigned at birth. It's manifested at birth, right? And we're talking normally. Obviously, we can use an ultrasound and know these things before birth, but normally is identified at birth when the child's body becomes visible and refers to one's biological status as a male or female. It's associated primarily with physical attributes. And then it gets into these issues like chromosomes, hormone prevalence, external and internal anatomy, and so on. So that's what we mean by sex. It's going to refer to a biological identity based on the physical structure of the body. Gender is understood in a different way. The word is used in a different way. And it doesn't matter what you think gender means. We're talking about how these terms are being used in these modern discussions. So there's a distinction being made between sex and gender. Sex is simple and biological. Let's think of it like that. Gender, they argue, is something else. Gender, we read here, refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that a given society considers appropriate for boys and men or girls and women. Gender refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that a given society considers appropriate for different sexes. So we're talking about two different things here with sex and gender. And we can't deny that this is a complicated issue. Gender, this is a reality. If we go from America to Afghanistan or Iran, we're going to see that the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes of men and women are different. This is a reality. We're going to see this if we go from one country to another. If we go to Mexico, we're going to see it's different from America. If we go to Texas, we may see it's different from California. This is real, that these gender roles and activities and expectations of the behavior of males and females is different from one place to another. It doesn't appear to be natural or universal. It appears to be cultural, to be socially constructed and variable from place to place. What people wear, in the Caribbean is very different from what people wear in Siberia. What women do in modern America is very different from what women do in, let's say, medieval Italy. So we can't deny that there's not a difference in that this is, to some degree, socially constructed, what men and women can or should be and do, how they should appear, and so on. Obviously different in ancient Israel and modern America. So we have to grant that this question of gender, because it varies from place to place, does in fact appear to be variable and subject to what we think is right and wrong. So we have to grant that this is a valid point. It seems that this is open for debate. And so it's not necessarily most helpful to argue what's right or wrong. I think the right approach to this would be to argue what's best. Okay, what's best in given circumstances? What would be best? And we'll often find that when people represent or take up a bad viewpoint, they often aren't willing to talk about what's best. They try to force the discussion into this right or wrong. They'll ask things like, well, are you saying it's sin if a woman wears pants? Are you saying it's a sin if a man is a nurse? They'll try to make this discussion about sin and, something is either right or wrong, good or bad, when really the discussion we should be having is what would be best. What would be best in a given situation. So we've got to be careful and recognize the difference between these terms sex and gender. Okay? So we can see how this controversy can emerge, because if human beings are the source of this gender, because we create these definitions of these roles and these expectations or standards, well, why can't they be challenged? That seems to be true. Now, if you want to say, no, God established these roles, God established these attributes, God established these activities, well, you're going to have to prove that. You're going to have to, first of all, identify what they are, and then you're going to have to prove that God, in fact, established those things. And in addition to that, you're going to have to prove that not only did God establish them, but he established them in, let's say, all circumstances. Okay? So the burden of proof is on us when we want to make an assertion about something that God has done. Well, we're going to have to prove that. And what I'd like you to see is Christians often don't prove what they like to pretend that they have proven. And it remains open for debate because it hasn't been proven. So it's a valid argument, valid point to raise, and I think these transgender people have the right to raise this question and say, look, if people are in fact the source of these distinctions, we'd like to challenge these standards because we think that our situation, our experience doesn't fit into that rubric, and we think it's more complicated, and we'd like this to be reconsidered. That's a reasonable position to take. Okay, so let's leave that open and be willing to get into that conversation, because like I said, it's not necessarily a bad conversation, and just because we may be convinced of doesn't mean that we've actually proven it to someone who doesn't already accept our assumptions. So if we want to get into these discussions, we've got to know how to do so and respect the other position. All right. The next question that we have on here is, have transgender people always existed? Is this just a new thing? Are there just, transgender people popping up out of the woodwork in 2023, and these people have never existed before? Did George Soros invent transgender people? Did the Democrat Party, pay a bunch of people to act like transgenders? Is this something new, or is this something historically human? Well, the article here says that transgender persons have been documented in many indigenous, Western, and Eastern cultures and societies from antiquity until the present day. So this has always been an issue, and I can accept that statement because we have commands in sacred scripture that forbid certain transgender behavior, and there would be no need to forbid these things if they weren't already being practiced. And so the fact that we see this dealt with in ancient scripture tells us that this is an ancient, a timeless human dilemma, okay, this question of gender. And, whether a man can do things that women do, whether they can dress similarly, look similarly, and so on. So this is an ancient issue. This is a historically human problem, okay? So that's a helpful point to make, that this is historical. This isn't something new. Keep that in mind. What are some categories of transgender people? What are some categories? So how do these transgender people identify in terms of different groups? Is it uniform? Is there just one thing, or are there different species of transgender individuals? So let's look. Many identities fall under the transgender umbrella, which again is a problem. All right. The term transsexual refers to people whose gender identity is different from their assigned sex. Okay, so they sort of take a change of their sexual identity that contradicts what appears in their physical body. Transsexual. That's one idea represented by this term transgender. Often transsexual people alter or wish to alter their bodies. They want to make their body conform to their perceived identity. They want to change their body to match their identity. And again, notice the interesting dilemma that's going on here, because there's this sort of tacit or unspoken admission that a human being is a composite being, that it's not simple. We don't see dogs and cats or cattle in the field having this problem. This is a human problem, because we're complex creatures. We're composed of body and soul. And these two parts of us, these two composite parts, it's hard to keep them in harmony. And we see this all through history. We see this dualistic view of the body versus the soul, and of the material world versus the spiritual world, and earthly things against heavenly things. We see this dualistic mindset all through history, and all through different religions, through different crises and issues that have come up through history. And we see this as a fundamentally human problem, because we're complicated creatures composed of body and soul. Not only that, but we're fallen. We're composite and complicated, but we're also corrupted. And so these struggles and problems are just part of human nature. And these transsexual people, for some reason, there's this strife between who they are on the inside. We're talking about this sort of character of the soul or the person, and who they appear to be on the outside, that is in their body. And notice they're talking about this distinction between who they are and their body, as if the body is simply a container of the person. So you see what's happening is we're getting into this deep philosophical question of what exactly is a human person. How do these things actually go together? What is the soul? What is a person? As I'm talking here and I say, hello, I'm William Michael, what does that, where is that coming from? Who's actually saying that? How do I think of myself and give myself a name? And how does that relate to this body that you see? These are complicated questions, and they're questions we should be asking, things we should be talking about. But like I said, they're complicated, and every Christian who's been baptized, every guy who goes out and attends church on Sunday, or joins the church, or who buys a Bible at the bookstore, he doesn't know the answers to these questions. He may pretend he does, but if we really get into them, most Christians don't know the answers to these questions. These are things that, even the church's wisest doctors were wrangling with, were struggling with through years and years. The greatest philosophers, Aristotle and Plato, disagreed on these things. St. Thomas Aquinas addressed these things, as I said, in the Summa Contra Gentiles, which is what got me, thinking about this topic yesterday at our Dominican meeting. Most Christians don't know the answers to these questions, don't know the truth about these detailed questions and sources of confusion. And remember, we're fallen creatures. We're fallen creatures. We may actually experience things that are real. That doesn't mean that they're good, but they may be real. To discount them as if they're just like being made up by evil liars is not true. We're fallen creatures. We've got problems. You can see that people are born physically disabled, physically deformed. People are born with eyes that don't work, with ears that don't work. They're born without limbs, born with all kinds of problems. God doesn't just manufacture these perfect people and they choose to be bad, or they're made bad because they're surrounded by bad influences. We're actually born into this world with problems, with mental handicaps, with physical handicaps, and so on. And you can see that this introduces all kinds of complicated, real problems that we have to sort through with an empathetic approach that's willing to listen, consider all the details, and then yield to the judgment on these issues to the wisdom of the hierarchy of the church. So again, the Christian arrogance and just always assuming they've got all the answers, when if we were to start questioning, individual Christians on these issues, they would have no idea what they're talking about. They've never studied these things, don't have answers to these questions, and so on. So let's realize that before we can even get into these questions, we've got a lot of study to do. Thankfully, we have means to study these things in the Catholic Church, but that doesn't mean we know them or have studied them. So there's this strife in the body and soul of these individual people, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. That's a good place for us to begin an evangelistic discussion. They sense this strife. They feel that who they are on the inside is not reflected in what they are or appear to be on the outside, to the extent that they'd even like to change their outside appearance. That's how much strife they live with. I mean, I don't think about these things. I can't imagine someone thinking about these things, but they testify that they do, and we need to give them the benefit of the doubt that someone's not just making this stuff up, because this is a distressing situation to live in. I don't think people are just sitting around inventing problems for themselves, knowing that it's all false. And even if they did so, it would just be a part of fallen human nature and still need to be dealt with. So often transsexual people desire to change their physical bodies to make them correspond to their perceived identity as a male or female or whatever else. We go on to read here, people who are assigned female biologically but identify and live as male and alter or wish to alter their bodies to more closely resemble their gender identity are known as transsexual men. And the same would apply to transsexual women. And of course, we know that people are doing this. They are taking steps to physically change their bodies to become more like their perceived gender identity. And when we look at that, we should look at that and realize that is a symptom of a real sense of strife that's present in these people. And we should want to help them find a remedy to that strife, not mock it or simply dismiss it as something that they're making up, but realize that these people are suffering from some real dilemma within them that there's got to be an answer for. There's got to be a solution for it, and we've got to try to help them find that solution. Another group of people in this next paragraph are cross-dressers, people who cross-dress, wear clothing that is traditionally or stereotypically worn by another gender in their culture. So a man wearing a dress, women wearing pants or something like that. Those are not transsexuals. Those are cross-dressers. They don't claim to be the other sex. They simply like to appear externally as the other sex. Okay, so cross-dressing. For some reason, people are attracted to this. Now, I mean, I'm not, so I can't imagine what would lead someone to do this. As a man, I like to cut my hair short. I wash up with some soap and water. I put some basic clothes. That's about all I think about my appearance. I don't sit around imagining what it would look like if I did my hair differently or if I wore makeup or look at fashion catalogs. I can't even comprehend doing that as a man. My wife hardly does that as a woman. So obviously I don't deal with this kind of an issue, but that doesn't mean that it's not a real problem people have. And there's obviously some kind of cause for what would make them even think to do that. Now, before you start picking on people who cross-dress and things like that, we've got to look and say, well, why do human beings like to act? Why do people like to get dressed up as different characters? How does that differ from being a cross-dresser? If I'm this person and I choose to go and dress myself up like a 16th century, explorer and act in a play and pretend that I'm, Ferdinand Magellan or someone like that, when we see human beings dressing differently and imitating other persons, why don't we assume that that is also some kind of depraved behavior, right? We don't think that way. We say, well, I'm just acting this part in this play because I want to imitate well, why do you need to imitate someone else? Why? You can see that there's something in human beings that actually leads us to like to imitate other people. If you watch a comedian, usually the favorite comedians of different people are those who do impersonations, who can imitate the character of other people. What causes human beings to desire to imitate different human beings? Animals don't do that. Cows don't do that. We don't have, a dairy cow waking up one day and deciding that she'd like to dress up like a chicken, right? The whole idea of imitation, the whole idea of changing our appearance and imitating other persons, that whole idea is a human idea. How can we justify, let's say, acting and then imagine that someone who cross-dresses is crazy? There's obviously more to this human person than a simple identity because we like to play other roles and pretend we're other people. Just think how much of your time is spent reading books and stories and watching movies where there are all kinds of acts of imitation going on. It's really central to human life, so it's interesting and worth digging into. Next, we've got this term drag queen, which we hear about. Drag queens generally refer to men who dress as women for the purpose of entertaining others. So it's a little more flamboyant and sort of intentionally attention-getting, right? Being a drag queen. So we see that more as a position of entertainment. And then we've got these other ideas, genderqueer we have here, and it's hard to keep up with all these terms, but we've got another one here. Genderqueer is a term that some people use who identify their gender as falling outside of the binary construct. So we say non-binary, that they don't believe that gender can be divided into just male and female, but there's more of a spectrum, and we may be at different places on this spectrum. And we can look at that and initially respond and object, but isn't it true that you would be willing to say that one man was more manly than another man, or that one man was sort of effeminate? Of course we say that. So is it a clear-cut issue that gender really divides into two categories, or is it more of a spectrum? Now that's a question worth debating. That's a controversial question worth discussing, because we can find examples of people who, even though they may have certain biological, organs or parts, their gender doesn't appear to be so clear-cut. And so you can see that's a controversial issue worth getting into and discussing to try to understand why that is. And like I said, when we get into those discussions, the transgender people often bring up points that are really challenging. Like, for example, if a person is born and has female body parts, but is let's say infertile or barren and cannot produce a child, is that person a woman? So we get into these confusing issues, and it's really not so simple. And that's why I say I find that transgender people often raise really good questions and objections, and the Christians don't respond to them well. So let's just keep ourselves open to these discussions rather than assuming we've already got all the answers and it's stupid, because it's not stupid. These are really interesting, real controversial questions that we should be discussing and getting into. Now we get to this next question. Why are some people transgender? Why? There's no single explanation. Okay, so let's ignore it. So there's lots of different reasons. So it's a case-by-case situation for why people are transgender. How prevalent are transgender people? It's difficult to accurately estimate. Okay, so the American Psychological Association says we don't know. We haven't figured this out yet. Okay, good. So let's ignore that. What's the difference? What's the relationship between gender identity and sexual orientation? So now we've got another term here, sexual orientation. Gender identity and sexual orientation are not the same thing. Sexual orientation refers to an individual's enduring physical, romantic, and or emotional attraction to another person. So sexual orientation has more to do with heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality, and things like that. What kind of person they're attracted to. Now again, I am a heterosexual person. Not only am I heterosexual and only interested in women, but I am, very strictly monogamous, and I am interested in one woman. The same woman I've been with since I was 17 years old. I have been interested in one woman, and I'm not interested in any other women. I don't even like to talk to other women. So again, this is not so clear-cut, because we've got different kinds of heterosexual people. We've got heterosexual people who are fornicators and adulterers, who are promiscuous, and then we've got heterosexual people who are monogamous for their entire life. So it's not so clear-cut. Just because someone is heterosexual doesn't mean that they're good. Just that so it's not that simple to get into these discussions. But sexual orientation has to deal with what sex a person of a certain sex is so-called attracted to, desires to have relationship with, and so on. So what's the relationship between gender identity and sexual orientation? We read here that they don't correspond. Okay? Transgender people may be straight. And of course, this concept is not very straight, right? A transgender person may be straight. What does that even mean? And again, the reason why that's confusing is because this term transgender is a so-called umbrella term that doesn't have a specific meaning, right? If a person is transgender and they call themselves a woman, and yet they desire to have a relationship with a man, boy, that gets confusing quickly, because is that considered homosexuality? We just see that this gets more and more complicated as we go, and that's partly caused by the fact that transgender doesn't have a single definition. If we did establish specific definitions for all and terms for all these different ideas, these discussions would get easier, and that's part of the work that we have to do to make progress in these discussions. We've got to identify all these different ideas, assign names, different names to these different ideas, so that we can then talk about them specifically and separately, and not just lump all of this mess together under one term called transgender. So that's going to be part of the problem. And when you've got people who enter into discussions insincerely, lazily, and so on, they're not going to do that work, and that's why at the public level, these discussions are never going to be anything more than just loudmouth, obnoxious wrangling back and forth that ultimately gets settled through violence. That's what we're going to see. Because it's not a sincere effort on the part of the different persons involved in the discussion to do the work to actually allow progress to be made in these discussions. We're going to have to identify all these different ideas, all these different scenarios, assign clear names to them all, and then agree to use all of those terms carefully and accurately to sort all this stuff out. But the argument here is that there's no relationship between gender identity and sexual orientation, but that's very confusing because once people start identifying as different genders, what does it even mean to be homosexual, right? So it gets very confusing. All right. How does somebody know that they're transgender? This is a good question. How does somebody know that they're transgender? How do people even think of identifying as such in the first place? Where does that thought even come from? So let's get into this a little bit. Transgender people, and remember, transgender is multifarious, so it means different things, so we can't read this scientifically. Transgender people experience their transgender identity in a variety of ways and may become aware of their transgender identity at any age. So we don't know. Some can trace their transgender identities and feelings back to their earliest memories. Some can trace their transgender identities or feelings back to their earliest memories. They may have vague feelings of, quote, not fitting in. That's very significant. Not fitting into what? Not fitting into what? You know, one of the greatest evils in modern society has been the development of the public school system and this whole idea of compulsory education, because we've created this artificial society of students that doesn't exist naturally and never existed in history. And if you pay attention, this idea of compulsory education and public schooling has created 1,000 different problems in human society that we talk about as if they're real problems when they're completely artificial. So what does it mean to not fit in? It means you don't feel like you fit in with what's normal at school or with what the other kids at school do. Well, the public school doesn't even, contain all of the different members of society, because there's kids in private schools. They're separated by religion. They're separated by socioeconomic issues. Not fitting in can be an artificial problem being caused by some human institution, and that sense of not fitting in has to be understood to be artificial. It's got to be understood to be artificial and not real. So that may be a legitimate problem that we are actually causing as a society, and we're putting people through this dilemma that they feel that something must be wrong with them because they don't fit into the box that human beings have created in society. So that's a very interesting point to dig into. So if someone says they just don't fit in, to be able to start probing there, say, fit into what? Not fitting into what? What exactly does that mean? And so on, because we may find that the problem is revealed right there. Others become aware of their transgender identities or begin to explore and experience gender non-conforming attitudes and behaviors during adolescence. And you go through puberty and your whole world is a big confusing mess, and you can have all kinds of problems. I mean, I remember my years of going through puberty. That was the darkest, most confusing, miserable time of my life. There was no direction, no teaching, no guidance. I was in a public school going through these things. You're going through puberty, your body's changing, you're being sent to change your clothes in the gym locker rooms with all the other kids, and what a mess that is, right? And so you can imagine people in these circumstances going through puberty, just dealing with all of this confusion and all of these individual problems and issues that can be experienced. No duh, people are going to have all kinds of struggles during that period. It's terrible, very difficult to deal with. And the kids need support from wise and sympathetic adults who can guide them through those difficult years and just help them to bear them patiently, because we often have no idea what's going on. People develop at different ages and different ways, and what a mess. Some embrace their transgender feelings, while others struggle with them. They struggle with feelings of shame or confusion. It's not just everybody, deciding they want to go get in the gay pride parade and the transgender protest. It's not true. People are really sincerely confused by these things and struggle with them. Those who transition later in life may have struggled to fit in adequately. Again, we have this reference to fitting in, which I think is interesting. They have struggled to fit in adequately as their assigned sex, only to later face dissatisfaction with their lives. They're not happy. They're just not happy. Well, that's significant, because God created us to be happy. And if someone's not happy, that's usually a good place to be in, because you're ready to talk and think and listen. And by the help of God's grace, be converted so that you can actually become happy through rebirth. So they're dissatisfied with their life. They're unhappy. They're unhappy with their physical characteristics. They're unhappy with their gender role, which again may be a social construction. That's open for debate. These individuals often seek gender-affirming treatments. And I can remember, as a kid growing up, there was one boy in my school when I was in elementary school, and I'm talking like third grade. And, I was sort of an athletic boy raised in a male-dominant family, and I hung out with the tough athletic boys and did tough athletic stuff. And there was one boy I remember in my class who at recess time played with the girls. They'd be jumping rope or, doing whatever the girls did on the playground. The boys would be playing, touch football or wiffle ball or, kickball, something like that. And this one kid would not come with the boys during recess, but would go play with the girls. And, when he, got older, became adults, got out of school, then you learn about all of this, identifying as this or that and stuff. We saw that when he was in third grade. Now, he never, would talk about it, and he got picked on all the time because of stuff like that. But I can testify that I've seen people like that who were clearly different when they were 9 years old. So I've seen that. I've observed that. He was different. It wasn't the same as the other boys. And so, who knows? These are controversial issues worth discussing. So some people are dissatisfied. Some people just don't fit in. They don't they don't want to play with the boys at recess time, and then they get picked on it, and they're unhappy, or they don't want to have a career that's associated with a man's career. They want to do something else. I admit I'm biased in all these things. I don't like the idea of a male nurse. I think that's kind of weird. I don't like the idea of a man being a first grade teacher in a school. I think women should be first grade teachers. Obviously, as a Catholic, I don't believe that a woman should be a priest. So you can see that we do have these expectations of gender roles for different things, or occupations that are appropriate for one gender and not for another. And some people may be dissatisfied with that. There may be a woman who desires to be a priest, and she's got to deal with dissatisfaction. There may be a man who wants to have a job, and he's gonna get picked on because of this job that he desires. So these are complicated issues, and I think we can all testify that we've seen examples of these things and probably feel these things ourselves in different ways. So we can see that they know that they're transgender because they're just not happy. They just don't feel comfortable with the gender roles and standards and expectations. So we can see that there's just sort of this nagging dissatisfaction or confusion. And again, that's interesting. We should want to get into that and try to understand it and talk about it and see if there's a real solution, rather than just pretending these people are all just crazy because they're Democrats. All right, so that's that. How does somebody know? We see they just sort of feel unhappy and weird, and that leaves them open to ask, what the heck is wrong with me? Why am I not happy? What should parents do if their child appears to be transgender? What should parents do in a situation like this? And you may think, well, only bad parents would do. You're nuts if you think that. I have a daughter who's identified as being gay, even though she's young, and I don't take these things too seriously just because I think life is so confusing. If you think that this only happens in families where the parents don't teach traditional Christian, you're just nuts, because it's not true at all. What should parents do if their child appears to be transgender? The same thing is, what should parents do if their child decides not to be a Christian? What should parents do if their child has anger problems or has other problems? What should the parents do? We don't. I shared a video recently that argues that parents are not the engineers of their children. They don't design their children. They are the shepherds of their children. And so when these different issues manifest themselves as parents, we've got to figure out what the right Christian response actually is. And that can be complicated, especially when we've got a child who goes through or struggles with some problem that we ourselves don't struggle with. Those can be very uncomfortable situations, and we've got to learn how to deal with them. So here we have this question. What should parents do if their child appears to be transgender? Parents may be concerned about a child. I think the first thing we should be concerned with is that they're not happy, right? That should be our first concern, to think, why is my child not happy? Remember before we said, if the child's miserable because they don't fit in, well, fit into what? So we can see that there's all kinds of questions parents should be asking. Parents may be concerned about a child who appears to be gender non-conforming for a variety of reasons. Some children express a great deal of distress about their assigned sex at birth or the gender roles they're expected to follow. We see this, just think about, 20 years ago, where we would refer to a girl as a tomboy because she didn't like to play with the girls or do girl stuff. She wanted to be out with her brothers. She wanted to be out catching frogs and playing in the dirt and things like that. I grew up with a girl who, when we were in like 3rd and 4th grade, she was a great baseball player, and she played on the boys' baseball team. And I remember we sort of, made fun of it, but we couldn't make fun of it because she was good. And at that time, physically, a girl could play with boys. Obviously, by high school age, that was all over. But we see girls often frustrated because they can't do what the boys do, and then we can say that there's also boys that may get frustrated because they can't do what the girls do. My daughter dances in a ballet school, and the ballet teacher is always trying to get boys interested in ballet, and she even offers free lessons, free enrollment in the school for any boys who are interested in ballet, because they can never get boys to dance or to study dance because of these stereotypes, because a boy doesn't want, most boys don't want to be associated with dance. I even encouraged my own sons to consider studying dance because the school that my daughter goes to is an excellent ballet school. And I said it'd be, it's good. You have to be strong and agile. It'd be good for you to learn ballet as an art. My boys actually went to one class, tried it out, and they were just like, they gave it the normal response, like, no way, and we want to wrestle, or we want to do this, or we want to go to the gym, and so on. So if there is a boy, though, who is attracted to dance, he may feel that the social pressure and criticism of a male dancer is so great that he just can't do it, and so he's just frustrated and distressed. And you can imagine that being a real source of unhappiness. Some children express a great deal of distress about their assigned sex at birth, or the gender roles they're expected to follow. I think that's the more common issue. I've dealt with that with a number of my children. Some children experience difficult social interactions with peers and adults because of their gender expression. Parents may become concerned when what they believe to be a phase does not pass. I mean, it's important to note here that they often are just a phase, and they do pass. So we've got to also have some balance here. A phase, however, might not be 3 weeks. A phase could be 10 years. So we have to learn, that these things can be temporary, especially when we consider they're related to school issues, they're related to puberty issues in adolescence, they may be related to issues associated with choosing careers and professions. These are phases of life. So these things very well can be phases of life, but the dissatisfaction and the distress that people go through can be so intense that it leads them to take radical measures to respond to those frustrations, and it can be a phase that lasts a long time, that they don't reconcile for years to come. Maybe even after they get through all of those issues and life settles down, they get out of what I call survival mode and just begin to think without those issues driving their decisions and feelings. Parents of gender nonconforming children may need to work with schools and other institutions to address their children's particular needs and ensure their children's safety. And this raises another issue, which is safety. To understand that kids are dealing with confusing, difficult situations as falling human beings is one thing. To see those kids getting, physically assaulted or picked on and driven into, despairing situations, that's something that we can't allow. We can't allow kids to be picked on and bullied and troubled in school because they're in that school environment which is unnatural and artificial and can lead to a desire to kill themselves for these kids. So we've got to be very careful making sure that everyone is safe, even if they're going through the most bizarre problems. We've got to protect them physically and even psychologically from abuse and things like that could lead them to suicide, which is a far greater evil than anything they could be struggling with in any other area of life. It's helpful to consult with mental health and medical professionals familiar with gender issues in children to decide how to best address these concerns. Again, this is materialistic and scientific, so they're not going to recommend any spiritual consultation or things like that. So obviously there's more to this than just consulting the naturalistic, materialistic physicians. But what's important to note there is that you should, before developing opinions or choosing to react as a parent, you should consult people who have experience with other cases of these things, where you can talk about your own experience and learn what other people are experiencing, what other people are seeing and doing, and what has been helpful or not helpful, what should be avoided, and so on. So consulting with others in a situation, especially when you're caught by surprise by it, is just sort of common sense, good advice. It's not helpful to force the child to act in a more gender-conforming way. So if your son wants to identify more as a girl, it's not helpful to force the child to try to act more like a boy, or to try to force the child yourself. That's just a matter of human freedom. This whole idea of forcing a human being to do anything usually doesn't work. So it's not helpful to try to force the child to, you need to act like a boy or you need to act like a girl. It's not helpful to try to force the child. The child's obviously having problems, and that sense of being forced to do something could have the opposite effect, could actually drive them to something that's worse. And one of these problems that's worse is like the desire to run away from home or the desire to leave home as soon as possible. If parents make these situations difficult to bear for their children, when that kid turns 18, he or she is just going to pack up and split. And the situation that results then is even worse than the situation that existed. So we've got to be intelligent and avoid making things worse. It's not helpful to force a child to do anything, especially in a confusing situation like this. And then peer support, getting to know other people who have these things, or at least researching these things, right? At least reading and learning, watching interviews, things like that. You don't have to go sign up for some group and publicly identify as a parent of a gender non-conforming. Give me a break. We've got to work, right? But just to take the time to listen, to understand, to read, to watch some studies or documentaries on the subjects, at least try to learn about the situation. Next, how do transgender individuals make a gender transition? So this gets into more of the mechanics of what goes on afterwards. Is it a mental disorder? This is an interesting question. Is being transgender a mental disorder? And we've got sort of a psychological answer for this, a scientific answer. A psychological state is considered a mental disorder only if it causes significant distress or disability. So when we see people struggling with this, where they have distress or it disables them from being able to live an ordinary life, that's when it should be considered a mental disorder. And we can see for many people it certainly is a mental disorder. Now, they may not admit that, but we can see that they can't even function normally. They can't even do ordinary necessary things like study and work or have relationships with other people. We see some of these crazy people on social media just nasty and violent, and that obviously is a situation where they're filled with distress and they're disabled from living a peaceful, ordinary life. I don't know how we don't consider that to be a mental disorder. But at the same time, we read, many transgender people do not experience this as a distressing or disabling situation, which implies that identifying as transgender does not necessarily constitute a mental disorder. Notice that this American Psychological Association is not saying that it's not a mental disorder. They're saying that there are cases where there is not distress and people are not disabled. Let's say a situation where a person has this as a private cross they bear, but they go about their ordinary life. They don't, decide to have their breasts cut off and they dye their hair pink and, all of the craziness we see. They don't do that. They just sort of keep it as a private issue that, they continue learning about and talking about. They may even act on it privately, but they don't find it to be a distressing or disabling situation. So we're told that it's not necessarily to be considered a mental disorder because some people can deal with it and it doesn't take over their life and make them miserable. For these individuals, the significant problem is finding affordable resources such as counseling, blah, 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 if they want to actually change their gender and so on. So they've got practical issues that they wrestle with and struggle with. Discrimination people face, obviously this is a problem. And again, I think that Christians really err on this issue of discrimination and their treatment of these people, because at the very worst, at the very worst, it's just sin. And the solution for sin is not imprisonment. The solution for sin is not criticism or, ostracization or anything like that. It's not shunning people. That's not the solution for sin. The solution for sin is conversion, right? It's being reconciled to God through the Christian faith. Christ came into the world to save sinners. That was the purpose of the incarnation, for Christ to come into the world and save people who are sinners. So even at the very, very worst case scenario, transgenderism is just sin. And so we're just going to end up back at the drawing board where what Jesus told us to do, go into the world and make disciples, is all that we can do. It's the only solution for everything. It's the only solution. So discrimination obviously doesn't make any sense. When we read about being supportive, it's sometimes hard to be supportive because you want to protect the person from any consequence that would be worse. So for example, you don't want to allow a person to be driven into depression where they might start to do something more hurtful, like use drugs or alcohol or consider suicide or things like that. You don't want to drive a child to run away from home or just leave home as soon as possible. So it's hard to draw the line sometimes between being protective of a person because they're in a difficult situation, especially when they're young, being protective of a person and going too far and being supportive where you're actually being an enabler or you're encouraging them to go down that path. It's hard to find that golden mean between being protective and going too far and actually supporting what may be a sinful decision in life. So that's a hard line to figure out, and that's the kind of thing we have to work to pray through and examine ourselves all the time and to ask whether or not we're responding to this as a Christian should. Because again, ultimately the worst case scenario is that it's sin. And that just leads us back to you need to evangelize the person and pray for them and seek their conversion. So being supportive, I think it's better to say, how can I be protective of such a family member or friend or someone else how can I be protective of them and seek their good? Make sure that they're not driven into some worse situation. How can I be protective? But at the same time, be careful, not to just sort of say things that make everybody happy, because we've got to really study and understand this, because admonishing a sinner is a work of mercy, and therefore I need to tell someone that you can't go down this road. This cannot be allowed as an option because that's not God's will, and it's sin. So I need to be able to teach the truth to people and be honest, but at the same time, how I go about that is a very complicated question. How I go about that is complicated. So I think it's helpful to think of this and say, how can I be protective of people struggling with these things without going too far and actually making them think that I support them in some kind of immoral decision? That's a hard line to take, but we've got to, that depends on relationships we have with people and our character and how well we are communicating things like that. Can we have a calm, sober, honest conversation about these things with a person who knows that we love them and we've already proven and established our relationship with them? Or are we the kind of people who can't talk with anyone who disagrees with us without getting angry and fighting and just blowing up and making things miserable? That's going to determine how we can respond. Because if you can't handle those discussions, it may be better for you to leave them to somebody else and not make things worse. One big mouth, foolish parent can cause a kid to just pack up and leave, like I said. And it may be better for some people just to be quiet on these issues. All right, so how can I support them? I think it's better to say, how can I protect them? And just make sure that they continue to have the opportunity to take care of their ordinary life responsibilities, to think about these things, to continue to be safe, to know that they're loved, to know that they have support, to know that they're always welcome to talk and deal with these things. That's a difficult work for parents to be able to handle with. And there are some suggestions here that are probably good to know about. Educate yourself. I mean, that's obviously important. We've got to not be arrogant and just assume we've got everything figured out, because there are legitimate human issues present in this controversy that we should be interested in as Christians. We've got to learn what's going on. What exactly are these individuals experiencing? Just because I don't experience it doesn't mean they're making it up or they're just crazy people. Your own sins are pretty dark, and your own corruption is pretty complex. If you examine yourself and confess your own sins, well, the same thing is true for other people, and they should have the same treatment that you expect to receive yourself. We get into this topic of names and pronouns. Some of that stuff I just think is it needs to be resisted. Like if a person decides to do something and then they make demands on other people, we need to say, look, if you're going, and I'll say I've done this with my kids through the years on a number of issues. If you're going to demand that you have a right to do something, well, then I have that same right as well. So if you have a right to identify yourself like this and you have a right to do it, well, then I have a right to not identify you like that and do the same. So I think that's an easy issue to argue through and discuss. And it's just, look, if you're going to claim this right, then you've got to give that same right to others. So don't bother us with, we don't refer to you by the name that you choose or the pronouns. If you want freedom and you're arguing for freedom, well, then I'm also going to have freedom. And that's just a good, simple rhetorical argument and response to such a situation. I wouldn't worry about that. Don't make assumptions about their lives. This is an important one. Don't assume the worst, right? Don't assume the worst. This is also true with homosexuality. If somebody identifies as a homosexual, don't immediately run to the furthest, darkest conclusion. Don't be suspicious of things you have no evidence of. Don't assume anything worse than what you know. That can actually cause you to react to the situation in a way that's unreasonable and unnecessary. Don't make assumptions about people's practices or their interests or activities. It's difficult to avoid that. It's a temptation to do that, but that's suspicion, which is a sin for you to do that, right? So don't make assumptions about others. Don't confuse gender nonconformity with being transgender. We've already talked about transgender being a confusing topic because the word is used in a number of different ways. Keep the lines of communication open. That's one thing that I would encourage you to be careful with. You can spitefully, to try to show you're a tough guy, destroy a relationship, but that's a loss on your part. That's not evangelistic. Christ didn't do that. So being able to discuss things calmly, respectfully, honestly, reasonably, objectively, having the trust of other people, that they know that you identify as a sinner yourself. You don't have this sort of fake righteousness that creates a hypocritical situation where they just see your ugliness exposed as a hypocrite, but to keep lines of communication by being trustworthy, by making yourself worthy of that communication. Get support processing your own reactions, just controlling yourself, thinking of whether your responses are reasonable and asking whether you would want God to respond to your sins the way that you respond to other people's sins. That's just a simple Christian principle of life. Seek support for dealing with your feelings, and so on. And then, so we get into this, and that's it for this article. So anyway, we've gone through a lot of stuff. What I've wanted to do is show you that there are a lot of legitimate questions and dilemmas in this whole issue, and a lot of starting points for evangelization that I don't think we're taking advantage of as Christians, and we're often actually destroying these opportunities by responding to them in spiteful ways that are just ignorant and stupid and contrary to the gospel. So we've got to be careful that we don't destroy these relationships. Now, this is obviously a long talk already, and I'm going to stop it here, but we've got a lot to talk about, and in future talks I hope to sort of dig into these issues in more detail and get more practical. But what I wanted to do in this talk was just to ask Christian people to pump the brakes on this issue, because we're not communicating clearly on these issues. We're ignoring a lot of really important issues that are worth discussing, and we're just copying and pasting lazy responses that really don't represent the Christian faith. And I'm not in any way supporting transgenderism. I believe it's sin, but I believe that lying is sin. I believe that greed is sin. I believe overeating is sin, and so on. And so what I desire is to help people learn about the Christian faith and be converted, to enter into a state of grace, and then with the help of God's grace, like we say in the act of contrition, with the help of God's grace, to confess their sins, to do penance, and again, with the help of God's grace, to amend their lives. That's the order that this takes place in. The changing your life doesn't come first. Changing your life is the end result of conversion. It's the end result of the Christian life. So when Jesus gave his disciples their commands, he said, "Go into the world and make disciples, baptizing them. Teach them to observe all that I've commanded." He didn't tell us to teach unbaptized people to live like saints. That's not what he taught. That's not the mission of the Christian church. The mission is to introduce people to the sacramental life, bring them into a state of grace, initiate them into the sacraments, and then teach them and help them to grow in Christ-likeness, to grow into perfection over time with the help of God's grace, with the help of the sacrament of confession. So you can see that the Christian faith, the Catholic Church, is designed to deal with a slow process of spiritual renewal that begins at baptism and continues through our entire life, even into life of the world to come. So I hope that that's helpful. We have to be more evangelistic. This political Christianity has to be abandoned, because we may imagine that we're winning these things because we win an election, but that's not the mission of the Christian church, to go win elections and get control of political offices. The goal is to lead people to conversion, that they may enjoy eternal life. That's what it means to do to others what you would have done to you. So hopefully that helps you to identify some issues. We can see these issues are issues we need to study and learn about. Questions like I raised earlier. What exactly is man? What exactly is this idea of identifying yourself as being other than your body. Where does that come from? What's going on there? What is the actual relationship between the soul and the body, and so on? You don't necessarily have the answers for those questions, so don't pretend you do. Take up these studies and work to understand these things truly so that you can communicate with people struggling with these things and help them to actually learn the truth and pray for them and make sacrifices for them, that God would give them the grace that they need to believe in the gospel and enter into the sacramental life, enter into a state of grace where they'll receive help from God to actually overcome these things and be able to bear their crosses. That's one of the mysteries of the Rosary. We pray for the grace to bear our crosses patiently. That's what all people need. Not just transgender people, that's what all people need. And transgenderism and all of this confusion related to sexuality and gender, it's just sin. It's just human sin. And the gospel is given to us to save us from sin. So let's take more of an evangelistic approach to this issue, more of a patient, humble approach, and seek to actually help people, not win political arguments, which is useless. I hope that's helpful. God bless.